Technically, it's like not even a book. It's actually an epic poem, and it's based off of five other. What shirt am I wearing? Okay, that's much better. Chapter 1, Streaking Naked Through the British Museum While Streaming. Supposedly, George Smith stripped down naked and ran, yelling with excitement, when he rediscovered the Epic of Gilgamesh. Can you imagine what it felt like to be the first person to ever read one of the most important works of human literature in thousands of years and be the person to translate it, if even only a fragment? It's such a beautiful work. It's a work that tells us so much about us, our history, what has changed and what hasn't, and ultimately what it means to be a person. So, spoilers for the 2100 BC 5-star classic, The Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is like no other man, but his uniqueness among men makes him a tyrannical and uncaring king. He is recognized for his divinity. He's 2/3 divine. I'm not really quite sure how the math works on that one. How you can be 2/3 if you have 4 grandparents. It seems like you'd always be some number divided by 2 divine. But apparently divinity need not adhere to the rules of logic and math. So he's recognized for his divinity and grandeur, but feared among his citizens who I think the modern word would be rape, but it's unclear how the 4,000-year-old story understands this act. The women who Gilgamesh rapes are only ever described in relation to other people. He, quote, takes the girl from her mother and uses her. The warrior's daughter, the young man's bride, he uses her. No one dares to oppose him. So it makes it feel like it's almost like it's seen as a violation of property rights and not a heinous act against another human being, which it is. But he's also described as, quote, taking the son from the father and crushing him. So maybe that's just how people talked back then. I'm not sure. Gilgamesh, the divine tyrant, must be humbled in some way. The people of Uruk, his city, cry out, and the gods hear their cries. The story is almost the quintessential hero's journey. Gilgamesh will go on a quest and he will come back changed. So what will the gods do to change Gilgamesh? Well, they make him an equal, of course. They create Enkidu, who is just as strong and heroic as Gilgamesh. Enkidu lives out in nature with the animals, so Gilgamesh sends out a priestess of Ishtar to go have sex with Enkidu. She takes him, seduces him from the wilderness, gives him human food and clothes. I saw something somewhere where someone was comparing her to Eve, bringing man from the wilderness with food and being the reason that he shall be clothed, and kind of taking him out of this naive state of nature. The priestess tells him that he is like a god, he is seemingly divine, and he doesn't belong out in the wilderness. She tells him that she'll take him to Uruk, where Gilgamesh oppresses his people. Enkidu feels a deep human longing, the longing for a friend. I guess sex can't fill all of his emotional holes here. He needs a friend as well. And he agrees, and he says that he will go fight Gilgamesh and take his place as the mightiest of men. So as he gets closer, man explains to Enkidu Gilgamesh is Vita Prima Nocta, and Enkidu is infuriated and yells that he will go fight Gilgamesh. Although it's a little unclear whether it's Enkidu being infuriated by the tyranny itself, by Prima Nocta, by that practice, or simply he's infuriated because someone else is the tyrant and he wants to be. I'm not quite sure. Enkidu confronts Gilgamesh at the wedding and the two wrestle until eventually Gilgamesh wins, but they each recognize the valor of the other. And my version literally says they embraced and kissed. They held hands like brothers. They walked side by side. They became true friends. Now, to me, it kind of sounds like when people used to talk about the uncle having a roommate. Now, I know some people are uncomfortable reading characters as gay in old text without it being stated explicitly within the text. So if the idea of them being physically attracted to each other or engaging in some kind of physical relationship seems unjustifiable to you, that's fine. It's not an important part of the story. But I really have to emphasize this. They are in love. You can decide what kind of love they are in, but a lot of the story simply doesn't make any sense if they aren't in love, if they aren't in a deep, passionate love. It can be platonic, if that's what you'd rather imagine, if that's what makes sense to you, but it's some kind of love. So now that the two heroes are joined together, Gilgamesh decides it's time to go kill a monster. Enkidu is scared and doesn't want to die for some reason, and Gilgamesh basically tells him that they are mortal, and given that they'll die someday anyways, they might as well die a hero's death. And they do. They go off and they don't die a hero's death, at least not yet. They go off and they go fight the great monster Humbaba, the guardian of the great cedar forest. Supposedly, I thought this was interesting. This part of the story was part of the inspiration of Princess Mononoke. So if you ever want to read this book and then rewatch or watch Princess Mononoke with that level of interpretation, if that's the thing that seems interesting to you, it seems cool. Anyway, so they come back even more glorious than before now that they've killed this great monster. And they are so glorious that the goddess Ishtar tries to seduce Gilgamesh, and he shoots her down because she has a tendency of cursing her exes when she gets bored. So, of course, Ishtar is furious and convinces the other gods to let her take the bowl of heaven, down to earth and try and crush him. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu vanquish the bowl of heaven. Now, side note here, I love that the gods have their own, like, specific bowl. You know, they could have, like, chosen any animal, but they have the bowl of heaven. They could have had some giant scorpion man. They could have had a dragon. They could have had anything they wanted. Like, nah. The gods get a bowl. And I think it's really interesting. I think it's kind of part of the aspect of how our environment affects us. Probably like in Sumer when this was written, a bull really was the most dangerous animal around. So anyways, after the bull's death, Ishtar is even more outraged and she convinces the other gods to kill Enkidu. So They do. One day he is one of the mightiest heroes who has ever lived. The next, he is a sick mortal dying a sick mortal's death. Enkidu, as people often receive important news in this book, is informed of his death via dream. Enkidu says to Gilgamesh, "Dear friend, dear brother, they are taking me from you. I will not return. I will sit with the dead in the underworld, and I will never see my dear brother again." But Gilgamesh refuses to believe it. And Enkidu, when he does die, well, Gilgamesh is heartbroken, like Achilles after the death of Patroclus. And Gilgamesh, well, he can't bear to let them bury Enkidu until after several days. Gilgamesh breaks down like a child afraid of the monster under his bed, later saying, "Death has caught me. It lurks in my bedroom and everywhere I look. Everywhere I turn there is only death." Gilgamesh, no longer cocky and headstrong, no longer unafraid of death, is broken and sets out to find Noah. Well, not Noah. Technically his name is Utnapishtim, but you can think of him as Noah. Utnapishtim was the great king before the flood, but one of the gods told him to do whatever he could to build a great ark and carry his family and examples of every animal to survive this great flood, and that it would be his responsibility to rebuild after everything is destroyed and everyone else is dead. For this, the gods granted him immortality, and Gilgamesh seeks immortality, so he seeks Utnapishtim. When he reaches Utnapishtim asks why he must prolong his grief for Enkidu. Why can't he be happy with his lot, which is much better than most fools, better than the fools, he says. He says of Gilgamesh's journey, quote, "What have you achieved but to bring yourself one day closer to the end of your days?" He says that we all must die, and death can come at any moment, but we go on with our conflicts and our discussions and our contracts and our architecture as if it will never end. But, quote, "The river rises, flows over its banks and carries us all away like mayflies floating downstream. They stare at the sun, then all at once there is nothing." He tells Gilgamesh that he can live forever if he can stay awake for 7 days without sleeping. But Gilgamesh quickly falls asleep because even the greatest hero, with the greatest motivation, cannot beat either sleep or death. Utnapishtim tells him that as a reward for his journey, he can go down into the great deep and retrieve a plant that grants eternal youth. So Gilgamesh ties himself to some boulders and goes down into the waters, into the great deep, and he grabs this plant but says he'll test it on an old man in his country before eating it himself. But on his way back, a snake smells the plant and eats it and sheds its skin. Gilgamesh has gained nothing from his journey, but he speaks with pride about his city when he finally comes home. Chapter 2, Lessons and Themes. I said earlier that this really is like the quintessential hero's journey. Gilgamesh doesn't really gain or lose anything material by the end of the book, just some cedar trees. It starts before Enkidu existed and ends after his death. The only thing that changes is Gilgamesh himself. And this means there are some pretty surface level lessons we can take away from this book, like don't be a tyrant. Gilgamesh mistreated his people because he was more powerful. So even if you are bigger and stronger and literally more divine than someone, it's not an excuse to treat them terribly. He had to experience friendship and profound loss to change this, and profound love. But we can learn from his story and an outsider perspective without going through his struggle. The other lesson we can easily take away is about moderation or fear of death. We should not, like Gilgamesh, thoughtlessly risk our lives and the lives of our loved ones simply because we will die someday. But we cannot be ruled by our fear of death either. We must find a healthy balance. We must live with the knowledge that we will die, but we must also still live. Enkidu says of a dream that foretold his death, quote, "When I entered that house, I looked, and around me were a pile of crowns. Because even kings die, and every king dies, and we must all accept our mortality." Gilgamesh, when he journeys to meet Utnapishtim, he must go to the glorious mountains that reach the vault of heaven, and he must go into the tunnel that the sun crosses at night after sunset to get back to the east for the sunrise. So he has 12 hours to make his run before the sun catches him and kills him. And as this work was part of the oral tradition, so there's a lot of kind of poetic stuff in there, a lot of repetition. So it is very repetitive. And it keeps on repeating. For the first hour he ran, deep was the darkness with no light at all. For the second hour he ran, deep was the darkness with no light at all. Etc., until the 8th hour. At the 8th hour, Gilgamesh cried out with fear. Deep was the darkness with no light at all. There are challenges in life where the only way out is through, and like Gilgamesh, we must run through the tunnel, even when we are scared and tired and we don't know what will happen, or even what lies on the other end of the tunnel. There are also deeper themes. Why is it that a woman must civilize Enkidu? Is it because a man without woman is uncivilized? Is it that anyone without another human being, physical contact, a hint of love is uncivilized? Is it because he needed someone else to see greatness in him before he could see greatness in himself? Why does Gilgamesh need Enkidu to improve? It could be that because without someone like Enkidu, someone who Gilgamesh could view as an equal, Gilgamesh was closed off and incapable of love and empathy, and he needed to see that he wasn't unquestionably the best in order to empathize with others. But I think more important than gaining Enkidu is losing him. I think a man who has known no suffering cannot empathize with anyone. For the most part, we need to suffer on some level to grow, and without Enkidu, without loving another human being, there was no one for Gilgamesh to really suffer. There was no cause for him to suffer, not in a way that could help him to be a better king. And I don't want to say that suffering is always like an inherently good thing. I don't want to romanticize suffering. I don't want to be like, oh, we need to make the kids suffer. I think we all kind of have some suffering, but I think, he really is this kind of glorious mythological king who's like beyond human comprehension almost. He's literally part divine. So I think he has this kind of unique relationship with suffering, and we shouldn't, necessarily, take on all of that when we're kind of examining our own relationship to it. And I think there's a very human element in Gilgamesh, not understanding what he has, what he's risking until he has lost it. He doesn't think twice about setting off to risk his life, and even talks Enkidu into doing the same, but he can't stand it when he actually loses Enkidu. Chapter 3, The Man Who Saw the Deep. I've heard this book also referred to as The Man Who Saw the Deep. Obviously, there is the literal sense that Gilgamesh went into the deep to find the secret to eternal youth, but I think it also refers to visions and dreams. On the way to fight the monster Humbaba, Gilgamesh has a series of nightmares, but Enkidu assures him that they are all good omens about how they will vanquish Humbaba. he dreamt about a mountain that fell down upon him. Enkidu explains that it's a favorable dream, and it means that Humbaba, the mountain, will fall. But later on, Gilgamesh must cross a mountain to find Utnapishtim. He also dreams about a bowl that pins him down until he's saved by a young man. And this could be Humbaba, like Enkidu says, but it could also be because they will have to fight the Bull of Heaven later on. And so we can see how dreams are important as a literary device, how it's kind of like, you could think of it as the first foreshadowing in literature. But they're also important to the characters, that these dreams grant knowledge and wisdom, and perhaps it was the dreams of Gilgamesh that made him great and granted him so much knowledge. And by the way, if you're enjoying this video and would like to keep up to date, subscribe and hit the bell so we can talk more in the next video about dreams, specifically in the great Ursula K. Le Guin novel, The Lathe of Heaven. It's a wonderful book. We'll talk about it later. But at the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it says, Gilgamesh, he had been granted a vision into the great mystery, the secret places. So I don't think it's just what he did, but the visions he had, the dreams he had. I've been reading How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom, and I've been thinking a lot about the value of reading. And reading really is, it's a kind of vision, a kind of dream we have. And this book really is a marvelous dream, borrowed from 4,000 years in the past. But for a few moments, we can read it and we can escape into it and we can become our own sort of Gilgamesh for just a bit. There, of course, might have been a person that the story was originally about, but there is no way that the Gilgamesh of this story was real. But we can still steal a bit of his world, a bit of his wisdom, only I'm not quite sure from who. The original poems were part of the Sumerian oral tradition before they were written down, and they probably changed a lot. They've been mostly lost. They were then translated into Akkadian and changed more and put into the epic. And we don't have much of the original Sumerian poems, so we're just working with the Akkadian version, a large portion of which is still lost. I think it's a third. And the different versions have been translated again into English. My version here, this book I read, is actually called Gilgamesh, an English version. It's by Mitchell Stevens, and it's not a translation. It's a stylized composite of many different translations from different sources. And honestly, I had to think for a moment, what is the difference between this and seeing a movie based on the Epic of Gilgamesh? I mean, obviously the medium is different, but besides that, after so much change and translation and interpretation, can I really say that I read the Epic of Gilgamesh? I could spend a few years learning Akkadian. Make a comment if you want to see a series of videos of me learning Akkadian, I guess. But even then, with all the time and translation and cultural differences and lacunae, would I really read the same book? But I mean, it's a wonderful book. I mean, at least this one is. It's a great book even. At the end, I don't really know who wrote it. It's an echo of echoes of different authors stretching back thousands of years. I don't know how many thousands of years. I mean, at least 4,000 years, maybe 5. But for all I know, it could be part of a tradition that stretches back to the beginning of civilization. I very much felt like reading one of the founding works of civilization. And parts of it are terrible and ugly and don't make sense. And parts are heartbreaking, and many parts really are beautiful in different ways. This isn't like reading The Bell Jar, the last book I read, which felt so real and so personal. It was like a highly edited and rather well-written personal diary. I almost felt like I knew the author. Like I had some idea what it'd be like to have her over for dinner. But this was different. This was the echo of echoes across all ages, more so than the Roman myths or Beowulf or even the Iliad. I think if there really is some kind of human wisdom to be had, to be understood from the visions we see when we read, then it must be in this book, worked on and changed by so many people. And the more I think about it, the more every work seems that way. Even The Bell Jar, written by someone from a few hours from my home, not too long ago, in my native language, was written in a different time, in a manner. It was written with someone else's words, and I can't see what was originally intended, if anything at all was intended. And it all must be changed by the unrelenting distortion of my own perspective. Yeah, so if you'd like to see me talk more about the meaning of life or why we choose to live and all of that, you can watch me talk about the bell jar over here. But don't forget to drop me a like before you go. And first, we have some words that I had to look up while reading this that I thought were kind of cool. There's rampart, which honestly I know is in the national anthem, just never bothered to look up. It means a defensible mound. There's tamarisk, which is a kind of shrub in Eurasia. There's soapwort, which is a kind of herb. There's alabaster, which is an ornamental kind of gypsum. And finally, there's votive, which means given in fulfillment of a vow, or a candle that is used for vows. But anyways, good night, good day, good potato.